Ladies and not ladies, I would like you a round of applause for Jenny that will talk to us about death by user stories, please.
Hello, I'm Jenny. So I've been doing a lot of thinking recently about user stories, and I've been wondering, are they actually helpful? Have we wandered away from their original intended use a little bit? So this has been causing me some concern. And I feel like we've wandered so far, perhaps, from their original intended use that we find ourselves in the user story badlands. And this is a place where these horrible, dangerous user stories live. Let me paint a picture of the Badlands. So in the Badlands, this is what the user story Badlands are like, so a bit like Mordor. When you're in the user story Badlands, you feel kind of lost and overwhelmed. You feel confused. You don't really know where you are. You certainly haven't got any documentation to turn to. So you're feeling kind of quite scared. You've got this monolithic backlog. You don't even believe in it anymore. So this is a bad place to be. So how do you stay safe? How do you protect yourself? Well, in this talk, I'm going to talk to you about a technique called OOPSI, which helps you stay on this safe path, basically, which is the path to value. And this path helps us accelerate our delivery and get quickly through out of the Badlands and towards something that's valuable. Okay, so if user stories are so dangerous, what's so bad about them? Well, the first thing that makes me feel scared is they're like a virus, and viruses exist for one reason. Anybody know why viruses exist? To reproduce. So they split and multiply and grow until we feel completely consumed by them. What started as a small user story grows and splits and divides until it can't fit in our iteration anymore. So it starts to feel a bit like this. In the story Badlands, we have this thing called creeping scope. It's quite a nasty creature. But the thing about the creeping scope is that it doesn't creep at all. It's not actually creeping. It was always there, lurking in the dark. You just hadn't discovered it yet. So this is a scary thing about user stories. Another thing that I find particularly alarming about user stories is that they all look the same. So from a distance, they all look the same. You can't tell just by looking at it how complicated it is. You can't tell by looking at one user story whether it's an epic or a normal story or whether it's complicated or detailed. How do you know? They all look the same. They kind of surround you and make you feel confused. So what's supposed to help us with that? Well, we use this thing called acceptance criteria, don't we? Which I'll come on to in a minute. Where do we do the thinking? So where do we do the kind of thinking that turns something from what comes in as a user need, a requirement, and comes out as something which is a target for development, a specification? So this was quite straightforward in the waterfall days because you knew when that was happening because there was a requirements document and somebody did some thinking and had a few chats with people, and then there was a functional specification. And you knew that was a specification because it was called a specification. It's much harder when you're dealing with user stories and post-it notes to know when this thinking happens. So we have to fit in this analysis and synthesis, this thinking, in order to have a clear target for development. So acceptance criteria is supposed to help us with this. You know, acceptance criteria in our user story world is supposed to help us define this target for development, to give it some boundaries and to make us have a clearer idea of what we're doing. But I really struggle with this. So my background is in testing, and I started out as a tester and then did test management and all of that kind of thing. And the problem I have with acceptance criteria is that, to me, they kind of look like user stories too. So we have the user story parlance here. This is an example that I just got from the internet. We have the user story parlance here. As a conference attendee, I want to be able to register online so that I can register quickly and cut down on paperwork. And over here, we've just got more stuff, haven't we? Because if we wanted to, we could reword these bullet points that are called acceptance criteria and make them stories. We could say, as a security data protection person, I need to have mandatory fields in order to preserve the integrity of data. We could say, as a user, I'd like to use credit card to make payment in order that I don't need to find some way to pay by cash. So I really struggle with this. It's just we're just finding more detail and complexity about the thing that we're trying to examine. So acceptance criteria are dangerous too. Okay, this is going really badly. The other thing about user stories is all of this lurking, undocumented detail under the surface. Feels a bit like this to me. Sinks the project team. Just because something can be written on an itty-bitty post-it note as opposed to in some kind of massive document doesn't mean that it's not complicated. So how do we deal with this in our agile teams? Because documentation is kind of a bad word in agile, isn't it? It's like, ooh, documentation, we're not supposed to do too much of that. This is how we feel about documentation on agile projects. Like, oh no, boo, we're wading through the documentation, sinking, there's a storm, everything's grey and perilous. Post-it notes though, pastel colours, nice soft focus, everybody's happy, lovely. Documentation, grey darkness, pull me out of the terrible documentation, I'm wearing an awful suit. Post-its, blow dry, shiny teeth, happy families. Because of course, if we're using post-it notes, we can't possibly be doing too much upfront work. Because we're protected from that, because they're post-it notes. If we're using post-it notes, we can't possibly be getting ourselves into some kind of analysis paralysis, because that's part of the old days. So it's a good use of my time to brainstorm 4,000 user stories on post-it notes, then write them up into Jira. That's a good use of my time. Then split them into another few thousand user stories, link them to some epics, unlink them, reorder them, get confused, put some conversations in. This is in a bug tracking piece of software. This is a great use of my time. And then stroking and grooming this monolithic backlog of stories that nobody cares about anymore. That's a really good use of my time. This is what Paul was saying earlier. This is a huge queue that we're creating. And it feels like job creation to me. So where do we put all of that documentation? I know we'll have a living documentation system. And that's going to be the answer to everything. That's going to help us all understand what we need to do. It's going to be perfect documentation for our users. We're going to use it to automate our tests. And we're going to move straight out of the user story badlands into given, when, then hell. Okay, so these user stories really are dangerous. So why do we use them? What is a user story? What is a user story anyway? And what's good about them? So I'd like you to just take 2 or 3 minutes to talk to somebody close to you and just have this conversation. What is a user story? And what's good about them? Just take a couple of minutes. Ooh, in a talk, you need to speak to somebody. You weren't expecting that. Go on, off you go. Anybody do this technique? Yeah? Great, that works in Paris too. Hooray! So, anybody like to share what is a user story and what's good about user stories? Anybody like to share?
For us, it's some kind of formatting of the information of the user needs. That's a common language between user, business people, and technical people. So that's for us, it's what it's supposed to be.
So, common language, and it's the format. Okay, thank you.
Someone say that to make a lot of decisions, you need to ignore a lot. And user stories are good for that because it makes you ignore the annoying part and complexity of things, and you feel you make more decisions and do more. Well, of course, in the end, you need to do stuff, but you can't. I don't know if that's clear or not.
So it helps you
Hide the complexity. Helps you
capture the important bit
make more decisions. Yeah.
to make decisions. Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Yeah. Okay, so it helps you share understanding, knowledge transfer. Okay.
business rule, and helps to transfer the knowledge between somebody that knows the business rule to someone that doesn't.
So it helps transfer the knowledge from somebody that knows the business rule to somebody that doesn't. Okay, thank you. Sorry, in the front, yeah.
It's a simple sentence and it shows the added value to the user.
So a simple sentence that shows the added value to the user. Okay?
It's nearly the same. It's to concentrate on value and on functional expressions.
To concentrate on value and functional expectations. So avoiding the technical implementation. Okay, thank you. Did somebody have their hand up at the back?
It's a format for a discussion.
A format for discussion, so to have a conversation. Yeah. So I had this same conversation with myself and it got quite heated. And I came up with these three common things, basically. So it acts as a token for a conversation to discover value. So we had people mentioning value. It helps us deliver things in smaller chunks so that we can get value earlier. This is a really fundamental, important attribute of a user story. It's helping us, do something, collaborate around a smaller piece of work. And that's the whole basis of our agile delivery. And it helps us track and estimate work. So there's quite a few different kind of things going on in terms of how people feel about user stories. So let's look at each of these individually. So it acts as a token for a conversation. So conversations are really good because we're much more likely to understand the needs of a user and their pain and frustrations and what success looks like if we have a conversation with them and if we tell a story. And stories are great because they help us understand the narrative and the emotional connection of the people involved and how we would act in particular situations. So conversations are great. I start to feel more comfortable with user stories when I read things like this. So has anybody here heard of Jeff Patton? Yeah, so Jeff Patton has done a lot of work with user stories over the last kind of 7 or 8 years. And he says stories get their name from how they should be used, not what should be written. And this, for me, is really important. This makes sense now. Okay, we want to tell stories. And then there's this bit, discover value. So I think a couple of you said, part of the construct of a user story is to help us focus on value and needs rather than implementation. Okay, so there's lots of ways of doing that. So this is a yay. This is the value. I actually went to a really inspiring workshop. It was a couple of years ago now. A lady called Gemma Cameron, who talks a lot about user stories, and she had come up with this idea of comic strip user stories, where you basically articulate a user need in a little comic strip. And it's 4 or 5 boxes. You always start with the last box, which always is a yay. It's not always a yay, sometimes it's a few. But it's either a yay or a few. And that's the final box on your comic strip. The first box is where the pain lies. It's somebody worried or in pain or unhappy. And then you think about how to draw the boxes in between. So this is the one that I did in that particular workshop. So at the time I was working with digital coupons. So Jenny likes gin. Jenny's run out of gin. Oh, look, some coupons through the door. What could these be? Oh, 50p off yogurt. Oh no, yucky yogurt. If only I had some gin. Bing! Hey Jenny, buy one get one free on gin at Big Mart. Woohoo! Yay! Thanks Big Mart, just what I needed. So this is about value and it's telling a story about value to me. And I like this because the alternative is this. As a customer, I need targeted coupons so that I like Big Mart the best. Yeah? So there's lots of ways of articulating value. We impose this parlance into our user stories to get the value, don't we? So what we often see is this. But of course, I work in BDD and with the BDD community, and we think about value first. So it's our primary thing. So we avoid this by this clever technique. We put the value first. Yeah, so we avoid that horrible pitfall. Okay, so we need to tell stories about awesome outcomes. We all agree? Yeah? Focusing on value, telling stories about awesome outcomes. So are outcomes stories? I don't know, I'm not sure yet. I'm just going to call them outcomes. Let's look at the next thing then. So stories are there to help us deliver things in smaller chunks so that we can get the value earlier, because it's only if we do that we get the value of all the investment in cross-functional teams. We've got to get value out there earlier. We've got to know that we're working on the right thing. So this is often how we feel. How do we know where the important stuff is? Everybody's seen this slide, right? This has been going around now for years about the difference between incremental delivery at the top and iterative delivery at the bottom. So our challenge is to find our first horizon of value. That's the first bit of chunking down we need to do. So if we look at this in terms of stories, I see lots of organizations, talk to lots of people who experience this kind of user story cell explosion at the beginning of a project and creating that big queue straight away. And yet as an organization or a team, they haven't had any conversations at all about what the skateboard looks like. What does that even mean? Is there a horizon for a piece of value that we can talk about? So we go straight into this kind of breaking everything down before we've even done that. Surely our first challenge is to talk about this and do this big chunk. Think about this big chunk. Maybe some high-level milestones that might help us navigate the user story badlands. This is a navigation. We're trying to plot a path to success. And most teams struggle to do this very well. So how do we do that? How do we start to think about where's the value in this? Where does the value lie? How do we start? Where do we get this kind of smaller chunk? And this is where Paul mentioned again systems thinking again earlier. And one of the things about systems thinking, which has been around since the 1940s, I guess, it's evaluated all sorts of systems, physical, biological, engineering, manufacturing, all sorts of different systems, in order to find patterns in systems. And one of the things that systems thinking says is this, that a system may be evaluated by determining if its output results in the achievement of its objective. So outputs of a system are really important for helping us know where the value lies, because it's normally the outputs that hold the value. Here's an example of that. If we were building some horrendous, great big ERP solution for whatever reason, hopefully we interrogated that a bit, we might have a story like this. In order to do my personal accounts and know I've been paid, as an employee, I need a pay slip. So in an ERP system, all of the complexity that involves, if you're talking about payroll, one of the really, really important outcomes is a pay slip. Another one is that your bank account gets updated with the money that you should be paid at the right time. So you can see that by focusing on those outputs, you can see where the value of the system lies. Okay, so our output stories. I'm not sure. I'm going to call them outputs, just in case. Another thing about systems thinking is that it can be characterized by the interactions of the components. This is the flow, the narrative, how things fit together, and the non-linearity of those events. And that's where we really need to understand the whole story. This is another thing that Jeff Patton talks about, telling the whole story, and understanding how interactions are important in our system. And actually, without understanding interactions and the use of a particular solution in order to deliver outputs, it's very hard to cohesively understand what you're doing. So he talked about this technique, story mapping, which I'm sure some of you are using. And he basically suggests that we have this backbone at the top, which is this very high-level narrative, sequential, the most common sense you can make out of your process from left to right at the top. And then you think about all of the other capabilities that might sit at one of those particular interactive steps. And that allows you to give more detail. The great thing about it is that it helps us chunk down a whole slice of our story, so we get to tell the whole story, but in a smaller way, with lower expectations, by using this lovely language of opening game, mid-game, and end game. So this is a technique that helps us break down. And we've got the story map, and these are, I'm not sure what they are. Are they stories? I think they're activities in a process. So just to keep it clear in my head, I'm going to call them activities. And finally, stories are supposed to be useful to help us track and estimate work. And this is where it really falls apart for me, because we know that we've got all this detail, and we probably don't want to implement the bottom 4/5 of this story, because that's not all valuable. We know that there's probably 20% of that story delivers 80% of the value. So we need to slice it. So we're not going to are we going to track an outcome-y type story through to completion? No, because we're going to deliver stuff that contributes towards that outcome as early as we can. What about an output-y type user story? We probably might only deliver part of that, certain examples. So what is it that we're actually tracking? We're not tracking a user story. We're tracking tasks and examples that contribute towards some kind of incremental value, but not a story. So examples are really useful for this. We give a very concrete example about a particular bounded bit of that capability that helps us implement a fraction of it. So examples are example stories. I'm going to call them examples. And if we use BDD tools, we might call examples with a scenario, with a flow, we might call them scenarios. Are they stories? I'm going to call them scenarios. What about tasks? I'm pretty sure tasks are tasks. So for me, that's a no-brainer. I'm going to call them tasks. So let's just really, this is Susan, the friendly user story starfish. So let's just have a quick recap about some of the things about user stories we've talked about. So we want to keep having conversations. That's all good. We want to collaborate, because then we're going to make better decisions. We need to chunk things down. Maybe we need to think about chunking big things down into slightly smaller things. We want to avoid too much upfront analysis. Maybe the format isn't so important if you're good at knowing what the value is and how to get a clear view of that. I'm just putting that out there. More chunking down of outcomes into smaller value-based outcomes. Know which level we're at. You know, it's difficult to know. I said that the slide earlier I showed about analysis and synthesis. These things keep growing and dividing. It's very difficult to know which level of detail we're working at. So it's helpful to know that. We want to be helped with appropriate documentation that helps us join up with our other practices but doesn't leave us in given when then hell. And we don't want to throw all documentation into BDD tools because that might not be the best way. Less splitting, more telling the whole story and capturing the process. So process is really, really important in coming to a shared understanding. And we also want to use examples to help us track our work rather than stories. How do we go about doing that then? So here's the big reveal. So this is a practice that I find really, really useful. It's called OOPSI. And it's just a way of helping make sense of stories and navigate into them whilst deferring detail and exploration until you really need to get into it. So it's called OOPSI. And if you try and attack it the other way round, it is poo. Somebody pointed that out to me after we'd already invented it, which was just a wonderful moment. Yes! So OOPSI looks like this. I'll take you quickly through the model. So you can do this collaboratively. It's a bit like example mapping, actually. It's a bit of a mashup of example mapping and feature injection, which Chris Matz was talking about, 10 years ago, probably. So if we start with the outcome, this could be a user story. It could be, anybody do impact mapping? Could be a how level on an impact map. It could be a Yay, Gemma Cameron, comic strip user story. So it starts with any kind of collaborative process to talk about value and the outcomes. The second step then is really thinking about outputs and illustrating them. When we get business people and technical people into a room and talk about outputs and collaborate on them and try and illustrate them, we suddenly have a domain model growing in front of us with very clear articulated data examples. So when we're doing this and we illustrate our receipt or our pay slip or our bank balance being updated, we ask the user for real examples of real data that give us the best understanding of that particular output, the most important one. And by doing that, we can get a very high-level, quick way of understanding the scope of the project with using examples at this output level. And we know that that's where the value lies, so it's good to have conversations about that first. And from there, we can just take the most important ones and think about the process and the narrative that helps us deliver those outcomes. So it gives us an opportunity to leave some stuff behind and just go for something that's important. And what we find when we do that is we tend to get a linear process rather than one that's got lots of different decision points, because we're only attempting to generate one particular output, which avoids that horrible analysis paralysis you can get with process if there's lots of uncertainty. And it also gives us a way to join up with the UX team. So we're collaborating now around a linear process, around a specific output, which we've illustrated, which is high value. This looks a bit like the backbone of a story map or the output of an event storming session. So there's ways to tie this in a kind of deliberate way when you talk about process into your discovery. And actually what I find is that it's much more useful to talk about outputs and process and then brainstorm scenarios and stories than it is to try and do it the other way around. Because otherwise because this way you've got much less wastage. So the third step is process. Outcomes, outputs, process. Once you have a process defined that you're all collaborating around and coming to understand, then it's a good time to think about scenarios. because you've limited down scenarios that are just applicable to this process. So these are the different paths through. And then once you've got your scenarios, we start to talk about inputs. And this, for me, is where the money is in terms of fighting dragons of uncertainty, you know, and trying to uncover context you hadn't considered and things like that, is where we use real data to think about preconditions and inputs that generate particular outputs and states of a system. So this is a really useful way of navigating that. And this helps us know when we're into techniques like specification by example, and gives us a kind of way of moving from a story as a team into a small set of examples that you might use specification by example for. Would you like a worked example? Yay! Okay. So, when myself and a colleague, Pete Buckney, who I used to work with in the digital couponing space, came up with this, we were all about coupons and digital coupons. So here's an example. As a retailer, I want to issue coupons so that I can engage customers and increase sales. So that might have been the kind of gin sort of comic strip, or it might have been a branch on an impact map. So we talked to our customers, the retailers, about the outputs. And we said, OK, well, give us some examples. What are the outputs of this system? Well, they're coupons. Give us some examples of the types of coupon that you'd like the system produce. I said, OK, there's a simple one. The one we use most often is when we're kind of trying to sell a new product range. So there'll be certain rules, maybe say when you buy a can of Coke and a packet of crisps and a sandwich, we want you to evaluate that and produce a coupon for a new sandwich range. We said, oh, give us an example of that. And they said, oh, rustic wrap. Okay. So we illustrated that out and talked about the details on here, talked about how would that be redeemed? Would there be a barcode on there? You know, do you want us to print pictures? So we got quite a lot of domain knowledge from that conversation. I said, OK, give us another one then. Well, different type of coupon would be when you present your loyalty card, we want to recognize you as a loyal customer, and based on your basket spend, so different rules, we want to give you some money to spend in the garden centre. So we talked a little bit about that. We had another conversation about, wouldn't it be cool if, as part of our loyalty group, we could ping you an offer on your mobile phone, which had a QR code on it, and you could redeem that for a bottle of bubbly, and that would be based on your engagement over a period of time. And we might want to text you using a kind of unique code that you could go and redeem manually in Big Days Out Centre, and it might look a bit like this. Oh, and we'd like some reports. So 1 day's workshop, and we've understood from a high level 4 really good examples that kind of describes the whole scope of the project. And we've got common language, the rustic wrap one, the Big Mark Garden Centre one, to share our understanding of how that's going to work. So then we said to the customer, OK, well, there's lots of scope here. Would you get any value as a business if we were able to launch this simple type of coupon first? And they said, yeah. OK, well, shall we just start with that? Forget about the others. We've captured your scope here. That's on the wall. Let's start with that. So what's the process to generate that coupon? Well, it's quite a simple process. You scan the basket, our system evaluates the basket, then prints the coupon, we log some data, and they get to view the report. So that helps us then talk about some scenarios. So what do we need to test that? We need a kind of basket that is qualifying for a coupon, and one that isn't. So as we move into our inputs, we can use techniques like specification by example with an example given to us by the business, understand everything we need to with their collaboration, and go build this, just this. And we might do a wrong product one, a wrong day, a wrong time. So that's our scope. What we notice is that these kind of group around evaluate basket. And that was interesting because for us in our team, this is where we were delivering the piece of functionality. We weren't touching the printer. We weren't touching the scanner technology. We were really building something that grabbed the barcode data and evaluated the basket. I mean, the scanner data and evaluated the basket. So interestingly, they all sit around that one. So if we did the same thing so say we deliver that, get that working, then move on to the next one and find that there's a different process where the loyalty card is scanned. And we get similar scenarios for that, but we also have new scenarios that relate to checking whether the loyalty card is valid or not. Our domain model is expanded because now we care about basket spend. We didn't care about that before. And we care about whether there's a loyalty card in the basket, and we didn't care about that before. So by doing this, we've grown our domain model, but only when we need to support it with examples. And there'd be a few other edge cases to test that. What we find with this technique is that if you start with process and then actually decide which of these activity boxes is important to you and think about testing those, coming up with scenarios there, you avoid immediately all of the kind of post-rationalization that you have to do with tools like Cucumber and specification by example, because by doing this, you already rationalize your tables down only to the columns and attributes that you need. And they're very much system test level tests because they're talking about events based on particular activities and inputs and outputs from those activity boxes. And then the process for the coupon, for the mobile phone coupon, was completely different. And we allowed ourselves to defer that until much later in the project to even look at it. So what's interesting as well is that we had two different kind of levels of test here. We've got the tests and scenarios and examples, detailed examples around the activity level. But then when you look at the outputs and you think about what's the difference between producing one output versus another output, you end up with some higher level, more kind of acceptance test scenarios. And these would be the ones that we would automate for regression tests. The other ones we would automate using basically a really good TDD framework, using the same example data and using APIs, Postman, that kind of thing. So we've used the specification by example to help us share understanding, but not dived in to any automation. So that was OOPSI. OOPSI helps you to kind of break down your deliverables into smaller chunks. It helps you have an understanding of the level of detail that you're working at so that you know where you are and you don't get lost and overwhelmed. And it helps you in a really speedy way find the smallest thing to work on so that you can deliberately take that tip of the iceberg and make sure that your team doesn't get sunk. So you can stay out of these badlands on the safe path to value and basically find your awesomeness. I don't know why it slipped off the slide there. So I'd really be interested if you could have a go at this, if you think it's useful. I'd be really keen to hear how you get on with it. It's just talking about outputs and outcomes in the conversations that I have been really useful in avoiding the badlands and avoiding that slow death. So thank you very much.